I would like to leave you with the sense that that when you're doing a safety assessment, it's actually a moment to pause. It's a moment to step back and to say, can we figure out how to reset? And can we bring, which you'll hear about in when I talk about the Safe School Initiative, the most important part is bringing an inquisitive mind. So I just like this quote. Not every threat is a school shooting, but every threat requires us to do our best on our very worst day. What I'm actually, even though we are front-loading Safe School Initiative and how to have some understanding about targeted violence, my passion is for transient threats. Those threats that are made in the moment or because kids don't have the skills, because there are students, and I'm sure every one of you has had students who keep you up at night. And they're not going to come in, hopefully, and decimate a community, but they require a vigilance and a resourcefulness and a flexibility and, as I mentioned before, never worry alone. And what we know from retrospectively looking at attacks that have happened is that they were missed opportunities. And each time we get a report a few months later, a year later, and they say, this happened, this happened, this happened, and you're like, oh. And so I find that it is depressing, right? If you have to listen to one more, our hearts are with the families that have survived. It's like, really? That's the best we could do? But I do think they're missed opportunities, and so we can rally each time with each student, the way I was even hearing when I did the tour about the effort that goes in. Sometimes it's 4 or 5 years before you turn the trajectory of a student. So what we're going to cover today: what do you need to know about safety assessments in schools? What does a culture of safety in a school look like? That's a really key one. And I'm going to whip through some of these things. The number of school shooting incidents, victims' deaths have increased dramatically over the last 6 years. And importantly, what you're looking at is each circle is 10 kids that are exposed to gun violence at school, and each larger dot is one event. And there have been 398,000 students who have experienced gun violence at school since Columbine. And to bring it home, sometimes when I'm in a conference, I'll have a social worker who will tell me that they were at Columbine when it happened, or I'll have, so it's impacting not only kids but also educators. I teach a Harvard first-year seminar course on psychiatry and literature, and I've had 3 students in the last 7 years tell me that they've been in a school shooting. One who was actually, thankfully wasn't killed, but was in the room with the school shooter in Texas, in an incident that never even got covered, because it's so common. So parents, teachers, students, they live in fear. And sometimes they have the perspective that schools are a dangerous place to be. I even had a neighbor tell me that she didn't want to volunteer in a school because she was worried that there might be a school shooting that happened in it. And I thought, we all know that really schools are still one of the safest places to be. The chance of a school shooting happening is the chance of a lightning hitting you when you're in the bathroom. It's 1%, 1 to 2%. So it's more likely that you'll get that kids get killed out of sight of school, and that's not meant to minimize. I was working in a school-based health center, and when the Boston Marathon bombing happened, the 2 terrorists were from my high school. How rare is that? What statistic is that you have 2 terrorists that are in your? So I hold both, and that's often what you have to do when you're doing this kind of work with aggression and violence, is hold both. The potential for a change trajectory, and safeguarding. So just briefly, how can we take a public health approach to school violence prevention? What we know is in 2024, the Surgeon General declared violence as a public health crisis, but we also have flavor of the month. Any of us who've been in education for a long time are clinicians. We know that there was like the decade of ADHD, then there was the decade of bullying, and another decade, pretty sinister, of bipolar, where, you know, and always want to be cautious about that, and how important it is to have a comprehensive, consistent approach. None of us need to be reminded zero tolerance doesn't work, and that we, in many of the school shootings, have excluded kids who then subsequently came back and still made people pay. So thinking hard about exclusion and what it means. I'm from the bent, human detectors, not metal detectors. We are creating schools that are locked barriers and investing huge amounts of money, even when potentially, or we know that investing in counselors and in resources that scaffold kids is really what we need. And this idea that 14 million students in our country have no counselors, social workers, psychologists, or nurses. And when we think about doing threat assessments, if we think of it as a public health approach, when we're talking about doing a safety assessment, it's a really tier 3. It's a deep dive into understanding the behavior. And what the National Association of School Psychologists says is, I like this way that they describe it. What we're trying to do, you'll often hear people repeat this, involves determining whether a student poses a threat of violence, that they have the intent, and this is important, and the means to carry out the threat. And in the National Association, some people, you'll hear the term behavioral threat assessment and management. That's how NASB refers to it. And when you've been hearing me say safety versus threat, I think language matters. It's like when you say committed suicide versus died by suicide. Committed is a crime. I think when you say threat assessment, and when you tell a family that you're going to be doing a threat assessment, alarm bells go off for them. I've done research with families post safety assessments, and they say when an assessment is done on them, they often feel like they are under siege and they're terrified. And so I've talked with Melissa about, I would encourage us to refer to it as safety assessment versus a threat assessment. Racial bias is, when we approach a child, there's a huge variability in terms of the racial bias and what our sensitivity is to that. Again, this is probably obvious to all of you all, but students of color are more likely to be perceived as adult-like and more likely to be suspended from school. Black children are seen as less childlike than their white peers, and usually black boys were projected to be 4.5 years older than white boys. And this is a study that really struck me. It was by a group out of Stanford, and they manipulated the names on a student record to stereotypically black or white names. And then they had teachers rate the behavior, say, what do you think, is this, behavior alarming? And they found that black students' behavior was more likely to be perceived as a troubling pattern, and white kids were seen as an isolated incident. So this will be important when I talk about the Safe School Initiative, because when we have a standardized protocol, we're less likely to have these kind of biases follow through. Dewey Cornell, I have so much respect for him. He is a colleague of mine who has devoted his research to making the Safe School Initiative applied and broken down to be accessible to schools and to make the questions available, schoolta.com. And he's really developed the GOLD training. What I loved about him is he field tested and looked at 120,000 students, 186 assessments, and there's important data that he came up with. First of all, the majority of students that we assess are going to be, and the language he developed I thought is important, transient threat. Made in the moment, impulsive, the child apologizes afterwards, and that's a key concept, and I'll review it more. But then the results here are really stunning that I want to share with you. So he controlled for school size, for the percentage of low-income students, and the percentage of minority students. And what he was able to show is if you bring in the Safe School Initiative question, the inquisitive mindset, a systematic way of evaluating students, you have 15% fewer shorter-term suspensions per year, 25% fewer long-term suspensions per year. And school authorities are more likely to hold a parent conference and use mental health counseling services. So, I mean, you all are a smaller school setting, so you're going to be having mental health counseling. You have it embedded in the school. And at the same time, I think this is in the state of Florida did embrace this for a while. And then after Parkland and various states have taken it on, but it really ought to be, I think, if I had my wand, I'd have 52 states embrace the same process of doing evaluations. And there's one other researcher, Corpo, Hobson, and Leach were in a different camp that were able to show that there were no disparities in discipline. Okay, so what do you need to know about school safety assessments? So one thing is just the differential between a crisis team, which you come together when there are emergency situations. They're sort of brought on purpose. You mobilize quickly, you coordinate with outside resources, and you identify the student and what you need to do. Safety assessment team really involves coming together around specific threats, having a specific purpose, which is to determine the nature of the threat and the appropriate response. And then coordinating, having some coordination with local police and school resource officers. One caveat to say is if the violence is imminent, forget the team. You know, you get the police involved, you go and you do what you need to do to keep everybody safe. So this is, if it needs immediate action, then we're not mobilizing the safety assessment team. We're making sure it's like, I also think when you are thinking about implementing a safety assessment team in your school, it's also an opportunity to step back and look at all the different coordinated things that need to be in place. So, internet policy. I would want all of your students to understand that as if you post a picture, even if it is a play gun, it could torpedo your education. It could land with a police officer at your house. So that's an opportunity to use the internet policy as an educational policy to help arm them. It's amazing, isn't it, how our language is arm, right? Help fortify them so that they, emergency room. Sometimes we have, I can look at a district's data and you can see that one school overuses the emergency room and doesn't have a protocol. So we'll go at the very end talking about what are some good tips that I had from Children's Hospital. And then crisis response and safety assessment policy, which I strongly think needs to be communicated, what your policy is with parents and students and the staff, which is why we're here today and why we're and in the over hundreds of assessments that I've done, these are the kinds of things that assessments will be done: assaults, possession of a knife, threats made posed directly or indirectly to an adult or peer, escalating explosiveness, swearing at a teacher or threatening to harm a teacher or a student, destroying property in the classroom, fighting with peers, injuring staff, engaging in inappropriate sexualized behavior, or posting threats on the internet. I see you breathing. Like, doesn't that just raise your heart rate a little bit, thinking about this? and And who's on the team? Who's on the crisis, on the safety assessment team? Each team, it's really important, and I'll go over a failed threat assessment. It needs to be multidisciplinary. So a school psychologist or counselor, someone who has expertise in counseling, who has an ability to have a rapport with a student, because they'll probably be doing the mental health interview, and you want to have someone who has that. A teaching staff member, a school principal or other senior school administrator, and a safe school, a resource officer or school employee that serves as a liaison to it. So having an idea, if you have Amanda, if you're out because your daughter's sick, who's your substitute that can mobilize, that can help lead the team, and making sure that that person has either watched this tape or is educated about the Safe School Initiative, so they figure out how to make it happen. And this is probably the $1 million slide for you. And because what you're being asked is how to differentiate between typical behavior and concerning behavior. So typical behavior, like we talked about before, impulsivity, exploration of provocative topics, low frustration threshold or misdirected anger, struggles with authority. And that to me are those are the transient kids. Those are the kids actually though that I really have an investment in helping them figure out how not to scare other adults, how not to scare themselves, how to build the skills. When I first started teaching, I taught a fourth grade science classroom with really precious kids. I loved those kids, still love them. One of them, when he was 12 years old, was killed by a police officer because he had a water gun in his pocket and he started to run. So this is important, what we're thinking about here today. And the concerning behavior, and this I've seen many times, bizarre statements or behavior. You may have, in a therapeutic school setting, some kids who come in who are prodromal, meaning that they're on their way to being psychotic. I've seen that probably in 5, 6, 7 cases I've had, where a student becomes disorganized, may start to say threatening comments, and you have to figure that out. Threatening gestures, violent drawing or writing, seeking information about weapons and their acquisition, or having sort of a warrior mentality. Really important is communication of the intent to harm to a third party. So that's called leakage. Escalating acts of violence, and the thing I want to underline is the escalating. So you see sort of mounting, increasing desperation, and agitation. Agitation is one that I missed with one student. So you really want to be mindful of kids who are struggling with aggression, about what their sleep patterns are. And and this is a CYA, but you'll see in one of the templates that I provided to you that I always encourage my child fellows when they're writing reports to include this in a report. It is not possible to make predictions of violence, and this is a time-limited safety assessment that takes into consideration risk factors and aspects of resilience. And I really want to underline the resilience. We're taking, even as hard as it is for me to be compassionate towards school shooters, it's a desperate act. It's an act of annihilation. And how do we appeal to the life-saving grace of even the most troubled students? So, Safe School Initiative, as I mentioned before, the biggest takeaway is an investigative, skeptical, inquisitive mindset is critical to successful safety assessment. And they collected information and they had different statistics about school shooters and who are these kids. 93% had planned out the attack in advance. Now that's a little scary, but it's also good, because if you have your pulse on your students, you may get some inkling before it happens. And I also think the idea that that 93% had raised concern prior to the attack that these were students that were struggling. So it's a little bit confusing because they do 10 key findings and then they have 10 key questions. So 11 key questions, but I'm going to cull out from the 10 key findings, which again you can read. I want to focus on 2 and 4, and you can read the other ones later. 2 is, like I mentioned, other people knew about the attacker's idea and her plan to attack, and this information rarely made its way to an adult. So peers, my sense being in this school, is you all have created a really safe environment where school kids are going to come to you and say, I'm worried. It is more likely that a student will tell another student. And yeah. So friends, schoolmates, siblings, that tends to be it. And this is the term I wanted to share, leakage. It's the communication to a third party. 86% of mass shooters aged 20 and under leak their plans in advance. That's, again, reassuring if we can, and sometimes they're going to do it online. And those who leak are often going to be more likely to be suicidal. We know this, but there is no accurate profile of students who engage in targeted school violence. In fact, we can have a normalcy bias. Some of the school shootings have been kids who've actually done decent in schools. Sometimes students will do things that may be provocative, and so I've had kids wear trench coats, and that it gets people worried that they're the Columbine, and then find out that no, it's actually someone who's struggling with their gender and has decided to wear a trench coat. So not making assumptions. I also was involved in writing about a case of a kindergartner, you all might remember, in Virginia, where 2 people had reported to administrators that they were concerned about this kindergartner. One teacher had overheard kids talking about the fact that this kindergartner had a gun in his pocket, and the administrator decided that a kindergartner is too young to have, how could they fit it into their pocket? They did not have a protocol in place, and they used age as a rule out. So we've really got to be mindful and keep that open mind. So in the 11 key questions, right, we said 10 key findings, 11 key questions. Why they did that, I'm not so sure. But I'm going to call out 3, 6, 7, and 8, and I'll go through them with you. Has the student shown inappropriate interest in any of the following: school attacks or attackers, weapons, including recent acquisition of any relevant weapons, and incidences of mass violence? So when you ask these questions, what you want to be thinking about is whether the student has the capacity to carry out an attack, and whether there's consistency between the statements and actions. So if you have someone and you're trying to figure out, do they have inappropriate interest in school attacks? Like, what are they watching online? What are the areas that they're really interested in? And here I just want to highlight that 68% of acquired weapons came from the home or from a relative. Right now we are having, I'm sure you've heard about it, where there are shifts where parents are being held liable now. It's only happening in 14 states that you can be held liable for negligently storing firearms where minors can reach them. But and I think many of us who are in this work know that when a child is mad or aggressive, that underlying that is often a desperation, that mad and sad come paired together. But it can sometimes be hard to be attentive to the sadness when you have a raging kid. I remember one residential, therapist telling me about like when he has a really upset teenager, he tries to think of him like a porcupine, like he's just, you know, bristling, keeping you as far away as you can. And sometimes you have, you know, you can go cross from suicidal to homicidal. Dylan, one of the school shooters, the Columbine, Klebold, his mother wrote a book because she felt such despair that she hadn't recognized his depression. And sometimes what happens is, and again, sometimes states get crazy, right? They decide, well, now that we've decided some school shooters are suicidal. If you're suicidal, then we do a threat assessment on you. That's stupid, okay? I'm not saying that. But some school shooters will think, if I'm gonna die, then I'm taking others with me who caused me this pain. So, we just want to be aware of that. That's why I'm highlighting that. And does the student have a trusting relationship with at least one responsible adult? Over and over again. We all know that, right? Connection is so important. And I want to pause just to tell you about a 4th grade teacher at Sandy Hook, after Sandy Hook. And she made a sociogram. Sociogram is when you identify, like, who would you invite to lunch in this room, and you kind of figure it out. And she would identify the marginalized kids, and she would intentionally try to build connections with those marginalized kids. And another example on a systemic level, at a factory meeting, and again, this is a smaller school, but you take a list of the kids, and then each teacher makes a dot on each student they had a conversation with during the week. So you begin to sort of see who are the kids that are kind of missing out, who might need more intentional social diet. And so it helps you see the kids that are flying under the radar, and also highlights that some of those kids who are the angry kids or traumatized kids may push you away. And can we catch them to being, reaching for them? This is a sort of scary one. Does the student see violence as acceptable or desirable or the only way to solve problems? So Jim Garbarino in Lost Boys, he interviewed boys under 18 who had murdered someone else. And what came across is that these adolescents had a shrinking capacity for who mattered in their circle, and a really low threshold for aggression. And one of my colleagues, Jamie Barrett, has worked on a curriculum called Fight Navigator, and it's helping mostly boys with how can they have strategies ready in the moment to avoid violence, and sort of exit strategies and ways to diffuse the situation, and practicing that, because it's not always reinforced, it's not always conveyed. Now I'm shifting away from those questions in the Safe School Initiative. These are other patterns that we see in terms of school shootings, that the steps towards violence, that all 5 steps don't need to be present, but you have grievance, so going over and over again about what happened, planning, preparation, and then attack. A grievance is one of the most common motives for targeted violence among K through 12 perpetrators. So an episode of bullying, a breakup of a romantic relationship, a failing grade, or loss of an opportunity with a sports team or other activity. And when you're in the rumination stage, that's often when there may be leakage. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. You can look at the slides because they're a little bit repetitive, but the 8 critical warnings on behaviors or psychological patterns. You see the research, the planning, a preoccupation with a person where they cannot let go on a fixated person. I've been involved with a couple of those. I've had situations where someone's sort of coming in with commando clothing, and novel aggression where they may be sort of experimenting to see getting ready, preparing. And sometimes you can see sort of an increase in activity where there's sort of an energy, and we talked about leakage, and then desperation or distress. And then sometimes it can be directly communicated, but doesn't often happen. So you've got to get the other behavior first, the leakage, the fixated interests, the rumination. So I'm going to go back to doing Cornell now just to help you with the language. And I think it's really important language when you're talking to parents or to educators, sharing information about the differential between transient versus substantive threats. And I'm also going to be sharing, when I'm going through the Dewey Cornell material, about the decision tree that's done so that school-based teams know whether it's how to proceed. So the continuum of threats, you go from figures of speech, jokes, transient threat, fleeting expressions of anger, transient threat, attention seeking, boasting, 80% of threats, that's usually where they fall into. Then the thrill of causing disruption, and that can be a serious substantive threat, even if, say, it's a bomb threat. That may be sort of it's definitely a substantive threat, but it may be that it was a poor choice that the student made, but still has a lot of disciplinary repercussions. Attempts to intimidate or frighten, and then substantive going on to warning of impending violence.
Hello. I'm here because as quality control and making sure I was representing Dewey Cornell CSTAG, Comprehensive School TA Guidelines, with up-to-date information, I spoke with trainer Jim Fager after I originally recorded this presentation. He kindly told me the information had been updated, and so here I am giving you the most updated overview. And for more information in all of their forms, go to schoolta.com, which is a wonderful resource. So what we all know from working in schools is that we need to make a differential of when we really need to worry and do a full court press versus when kids are saying things that are impulsive and inappropriate but not dangerous. So CSTAG is an evidence-based model for schools used to conducting threat assessments in K through 12 schools. And it builds on the FBI and Department of Education guidelines to make practical procedures for school administrators responding to threats of violence. Dewey Cornell's group has really shown impressive evidence through controlled studies and field testing that if you approach threats and systematically triage the threats with this model, you can then put resources into effectively dealing with the most serious threats, rather than treating all threats as equal. So now I'm going to walk you through the steps defined by CSTAG to evaluate a threat. So a student makes a threat, and the first step is to document the threat and observations and ask about circumstances and do a safety interview to determine the student's intentions. The critical question you're asking in this model is there a communication or behavior suggesting intent to harm? Step 2, and this is a key one, is determine whether the threat is transient. A transient threat lacks details, is made in anger or frustration, or as a joke, and the information is inconsistent and vague, and ends in an apology or an explanation. Some examples of transient threats are like a child says, "I'm going to break you in half," during a recess argument, a teen who says, "I'm going to kill you," to a friend during a basketball game, or a second grader who says, "I'm going to blow up the school with a nuclear bomb." Luckily, 78% of threats are transient threats, And these are threats that can be handled by a teacher or administrator and used as a teaching opportunity to clarify expectations about not talking about hurting people at school and having a safe learning environment. Any threat that can't be readily identified as a transient threat should be treated as substantive. A substantive threat has some intent to harm someone. And the most important distinction between a transient threat and a substantive threat is that the team must take protective action so that a substantive threat is not carried out. Some presumptive indicators of substantive threats are specific, plausible details. I'm going to bring my brother's gun to school if you don't stop bothering me. Threats repeated over time. He's been telling everyone he's going to get you. Threats reported as a plan. Don't come to lunch on Tuesday. Something's going down in the cafeteria. Recruitment of accomplices or an audience, or physical evidence of intent, like a written plan, hit list, materials. We divide substantive threats into two categories, and honestly, the names are confusing. This is the CSTAG model. There are serious substantive threats, which are threats to hit, fight, or beat up. And then there are very serious substantive threats, which are threats to kill, rape, or cause serious injury with a weapon. Diving a little deeper, serious substantive threats, some intent to harm someone, a threat to hit, fight, or beat up, direct, detailed, specific, appear to pose imminent danger to safety of others, and requires protective action. It's mitigated largely by school personnel. So you can, school personnel's responsibility is to protect potential victims, supervise the student, apply disciplinary measures as appropriate after the safety measures are implemented. Very serious substantive threats is a threat to kill, rape, or cause serious injury with a weapon, require immediate protective action, require comprehensive action, including law enforcement investigation, safety interviews, and a safety plan, and require supervising the student outside the regular classroom learning environment until the investigation is complete and a safety plan is developed. Law enforcement role is to conduct an investigation for evidence of planning. The goals of the safety interview, which are done by the school, are identifying any mental health support needs the student may have and understanding why the threat was made and what might reduce the likelihood of violence. So, now that we've covered the terminology, let's look again at the flow sheet. How we classify the threat determines the response. So, you evaluate the threat, you figure out whether it's transient or it's a substantive or a very serious substantive threat. If it's a serious substantive threat, you take the precautions to protect potential victims, you warn the intended victims and parents, you look for ways to resolve the conflict, and you discipline the student when appropriate. If it's a very serious substantive threat, a threat to kill, rape, or cause serious injury with a weapon, you do this A through D, but you also screen the student for mental health services and counseling, refer as needed, law enforcement investigation for evidence of planning, preparation, and criminal activity, and you develop a safety plan that reduces risk and addresses students' needs. The plan should include the review of the individual ed plan if already receiving special education services, and further assessment if possible disability. So we've done it. We've gone through a preliminary introduction to the CSTAG model, and of course, schoolta.com is a place where you can learn more about it. And back to my lecture.
But really, I want to say, if you can develop a safety plan that reduces risk and addresses the student need, that's really key. So reviewing the behavioral plan, the IEP, the placement is really key. This is just a brief thing. We're looking at a drawing of a kid with a gun. He's disruptive in class. He comes from a troubled background. The picture's drawn, and his teacher reports that she's concerned and comes to the principal. Do you think it's transient or substantive? Anyone want to help me out?
I think you don't know until you find more information.
Nice, exactly. So what if I told you that the teacher had overheard kids talking, and this same student was bragging that his older brother had a gun, and he knows where it is in the house, and he got spanked when he got home, and the other kids would be sorry for acting up in school? Substantive. That's when you do a full court press, right? And really important that age does matter, making the call, but the context is key. So one thing I want to go over is the FERPA versus HIPAA. So FERPA is around protecting most educational records by classifying them as confidential and limiting their disclosure, and applies to all educational agencies and institutions that receive DOE funds. And you're not supposed to disclose the educational records of students, including mental health records kept by the school, or personally identifying information derived from such records without the written consent of a parent or 18+ student. But it does, and this is really important, y'all, it does permit disclosure under health or safety emergency provision when necessary to protect the health or safety of the student or other individuals. That's really important for you to know, because sometimes some of the school shootings that have happened have been because of confusion around sharing information. So safety first. I tell families when I work with them, when I work with a suicidal family, I've worked with college kids that are suicidal, and now we're talking about HIPAA, but I say, if I'm going to work with you in my practice, unless your parent is completely abusive, I need to be able to share the responsibility, and I need to be able to talk with them if you are telling me that you want to end your life. So HIPAA protects the that's the hospital clinician side of things, protects the privacy and security of individually identifiable health information, and it does also permit healthcare providers to disclose private health information about a student to a school nurse for treatment purposes without parental consent. And also, if you're doing an assessment and you need to get a hold of them and you can't get a hold of, so you have my phone number now, but you know, if you need information, you can override the HIPAA if you're really concerned about safety. So when assessments are done, what you want, if someone is coming from an outside school and they're applying to come to your therapeutic school, information that you're going to want to know if they had an event in their school. What I would want is an incident report. If you have incident reports in your school, I would encourage you to have, I always encourage schools to have antecedent, because what often happens in incident reports is everybody micro dives into what happened at the moment of the aggression, but forgets to talk about the inciting events. So just putting in antecedents can be a really useful reminder. I think there's someone here who's an ABA person, aren't we? Ah, so that's music to you. Is that music to your ears?
It sure is.
Okay.
We do record what happened leading up to the incident.
In your incident reports, yeah. Great. So this is music to my ears. And then any psychological and neuropsych testing, and then interview with the student, the parent, and the school personnel. Sometimes it can be tricky, especially in a transient threat, but one that's keeping you up at night is getting, maybe not here, but sometimes parents don't want to give permission. One of my hardest evals was a situation where a parent didn't want to give permission, and the school district actually, that's a real bottleneck, right? You get parents who don't give permission, and the school district needed to file with DCSF to say that this is neglect to not allow the school to be able to do the evaluation. So that was a really important end run around to be able to do it. And it was a good one, because this was a student who was in a classroom of about 7 kids, and he was terrorizing the female teacher. And again, was he a school shooter? Probably not, but he wasn't. But he was drawing really aggressive pictures throughout the day and off task. And when I interviewed him, he said, I know exactly how to kill someone without using a weapon. And my heart just chilled. There was no remorse. And I recommended in that situation for the student not to stay in that school placement. I felt like they're a good term for you all to use if you ever need to have an exit of a student that's terrifying you is error history. If there is so much, that's code for trauma, but if there's so much error history, and as an ABA, you know error history, right? You can't change the pattern. Right. So call it quits. Knowing when to call it quits, when it's too intimidating and too difficult, is really also important. This is more things that when you're doing an assessment, you want to, in my assessments, you speak about the limits of confidentiality, and you look at various things like exposure to violence, mental health assessment, peer relationships and bullying, access to weapons, and substance abuse. And we talked about this before, but just to highlight, 68% of acquired weapons come from home or from a relative. And this next slide I'm going to show just always makes my heart beat a little faster, just to give you a pre-warning. I'm a clinician. I don't think of myself as a weapon expert, but it is important to, if you're at this point where you're assessing for weapons, I always encourage you, even if it's a fourth grader who's making gravestones on the access for weapons, you really want to know that with, I've been burned because sometimes you'll ask about home, but I had it one time when it was a grandparent's home was where the weapon came from. So a relative's home or a friend's house, you kind of want to ask it broad. And then when you're assessing at this point, when you're going to this deep dive of these questions, you want to have your school resource officer or your legal enforcement person to be helping you when you're asking about training classes, seeking gun show attendance, stockpiling ammunition, purchasing, possession, identifying weapons, ghost guns, that kind of piece. But yeah.
What's straw purchasing?
A straw purchase refers to a transaction where one person buys a good or service on behalf of another. So it's often someone who's legally prohibited from making the purchase themselves. This is just reiterating what I said in that we can't predict violence. We're just looking. And this is just to go over a range of recommendations that I discuss with schools. What I would say is many times when a school is asking for an outside person to help weigh in, they're asking the question, and I would encourage for you all when you're bringing students into your setting, does the school have the resources to provide for the student and facilitating access to mental health service, and really documenting, having an action plan. It's very important. Sometimes in situations that I've been involved with, there's not enough documentation to help with making that decision. So I don't want to get you all too down though. I mean, sometimes doing these assessments can be really exciting because you're helping kids get access to resources. I once had a student where a teacher told me, I think this child has murder in his eyes. And really what he had was a lot of trauma, and he had really untreated ADHD and lots of impulsivity. And he had never been on a field trip. And it took a fair amount of coordination to help him get the treatment that he needed for his ADHD. It was a family from a different cultural background that we didn't do meds, and a fair amount of hand-holding. And he ended up being able to go on a field trip for the first time when he was in 6th grade. And, you know, so you can get in there and do interventions. And this is part part of when you're building a response management plan for the highest risk cases. You're thinking about duty to warn, you're trying to contain the situation, you're providing information in event of another incident with the same student, and providing a baseline for future behavior so you know if things are recurring. And an important one is ensuring with the districts you're working with that they are allowing communication, that they're giving you the records that you need to make a decision. They may not be in the school record, but you want to explicitly ask for, are there any assessments that have been done that are not in the papers that you're giving to me, in the traditional papers that you're giving to me? Because we all know getting into therapeutic school placement is equivalent to getting into college, and you may just decide to leave out pertinent information. So these are just going over in the response management plan, considering immediate interventions. This is a really key one, discussing how to repair the relationship, putting an emphasis on restorative justice. That's a tricky one. Sometimes I've been involved, and again, it may not happen here, but I was involved in a situation where a student was seen as a threat. But what I found out when I interviewed various people was that the staff member had actually threatened the student before. So how do you repair that? And what is restorative justice? Something to really think about. You all have more than weekly meetings, so I don't skip that. Benchmarks for that, and this is a key one, considering staff capacity. Sometimes when you're working with aggressive kids, they are exhausting. I have done assessments where, not to demoralize you all, but where teachers are clinically depressed because it's been such a struggle. And the really unfair thing is the most competent teachers are often the ones who get the most aggressive kids because they know that they're structured, so you're overweighting that. And so I also love Dan Hughes talks about having a system in place where you tap in. You really get equitable about that aspect of it. If you're going to overload one classroom with particularly difficult kids, what's the respite for that staff member? This is just how do you do buy-in? I think that's really important. When I've done training for educators, one of the hardest things is helping staff really decide this is something that we're going to commit to ourselves for the safety of us and for the safety of our students and our families. This is just a quick one around school-wide protocols for a behavioral health crisis. I think it's really important to define what a behavioral crisis is that ends up prompting you to call the ER, and who's the point person that contacts the family, and what happens if you can't reach a family member in an emergency, which can happen, which emergency services could be used when they should be used, and the contact information for those individuals and agencies, and what kind of follow-up is there? Is there debriefing, a documentation? And most importantly, I would say, particularly for school safety, is the re-entry process. That's a time when there has sometimes been a grievance that a kid feels, and they come back to school, and they're going to even the score. So you definitely want to think about that piece of it. So just to give you a flavor for what clinicians sometimes are dealing with, is he safe to come back to school? Is the perennial question that many clinicians get asked. So it can be a student with aggression being seen for medication management. It can be a student who's been inpatient. He's made a threat and then he's hospitalized. It can be a student who's been sent to the ER from school, and it can be an outpatient student, outpatient clinician. These are just two resources that you can download, but also were given. They just don't cost $100. Dewey Cornell's is more expensive, and these are free, and you can download them, so that was why. Okay. This is really important. I'm going to spend 15 minutes on this because what does a culture of safety in a school look like? So this was really amazing, y'all. I've been doing assessments probably for about 15 years, and I read this paper by Goodrum, Sarah Goodrum, who's now become a close colleague, someone I really respect. And I wrote her because I had this aha moment. I've been talking to you in the Safe School Initiative, and it's so, yes, you're supposed to sort of think about the school climate, but it doesn't really say what you're supposed to think about in the school climate. And she had, she's a sociologist out of Colorado, and she had done this study on a completed school shooting. And she collected like 8,000 pages, did 100 interviews, and came out with what are the salient aspects of a school culture. And all of a sudden I had this aha moment, because every time you read, like I was saying at the beginning, every time you read about a school shooting and then they say, oh, these mistakes were made, but I didn't quite know, like, well, and like, how do we avoid that? Why do I keep reading this? And, you know, so I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail. 2013, there was a shooting at a Colorado high school. It was a 18-year-old white male high school senior at a large suburban high school. Record of low-level behavior problems. He was the student leader in speech and debate club, and he'd had inappropriate behavior at events. He was pissed because he'd had a demotion from leadership position, and he'd threatened a debate coach, and a threat assessment was conducted. So this was the threat assessment. Do not do this. Because when told he would not be captain of speech and debate, he went on an emotional, quote unquote, emotional tirade and said, I'm going to kill that guy, referring to the team's coach. This is not your ideal threat assessment, okay? It's a pretty kind of, he had access to weapons, none known. Mom reports deep-seated anger, and he's not remorseful or understanding, is some of what it says. You can't see all of it. And this is key, you all. If you're doing a threat assessment here, you talk to the student peers. That's encouraged in the Secret Service guideline. What's important when I say that, though, is you all want to have a protocol here, because you don't want to have one teacher decide to take it into her hands to start talking to the teachers, to the students about what's going on. And I've been involved with cases like that where there's not a confidence in the leadership. So you decide, I'm going to take it into my own hands, and that can backfire. So you really want to have a protocol in place that allows it not to be like a lone soldier doing that. And so we had another outburst. The student in his language class would scare, what we found out later, once interviewing, is that he had scared his teachers and classmates. And when the language teacher notified the assistant principal of this student's outburst, another threat assessment should have been conducted, but it wasn't. So if you have done a safety assessment, you want to think about the criteria for what's going to initiate another deep dive into it. What Sarah Goodrum did in doing the deep dive around how do these school shootings happen, sorry about this, barriers to an effective assessment, one principal said, we wanted to make sure that kids weren't inappropriately judged by teachers. We thought it would give the student a fresh start with a new teacher. We were just erring more on side of protecting the kid, and I misinterpreted FERPA. So keep that in mind around when you bring in new teachers, about educating them around sharing information when it comes to safety. The U.S. Department of Education has clarified some of this confusion, and you can know that you're and so we saw the first problem was the quality of the threat assessment. It was bogus, and that's a clinical word. And then lack of experience with interviewing, that there wasn't, and this idea of having a critical, skeptical, and inquisitive mindset, and a belief in the fresh start mentality. So may say, let's send them to a new school because they're going to give them a fresh start, but then you're not providing with the information that you need to understand what. So you minimize the negative information, and you block communication across teachers. So, and then the idea of the lack of follow-up that we heard about. So I like this quote. I think it takes all of us to keep the school safe, and information is important, and communication is important, and that there should be a way that we know about every student in trouble in the school. So I like these 5 characteristics of a culture of safety. Staff need, which is what you're doing today, need to be informed about the knowledge in the knowledge in the field, and that leaders want to promote reports of concerns, problems, mistakes, and near misses. So we heard with the kindergartner, the teacher reports to the administrator, but the administrator isn't acting on it. And that this is a hard one, that you create an atmosphere of trust in a place where you aren't seen as being quote unquote hysterical if you report a safety concern, but staying flexible and willing. Willing to learn and adjust to the functioning of its safety system. So if you have a glitch and you make a mistake in your assessment, can you go back and look at what might have happened? How did we end up having a student that really had so much error history, and is there a way we can tighten up the system to do that? This is just switching, but also a recommendation that the training, when she said it was inadequate training, it had been like a hour and a half training versus the expectation should be that all staff are part of the training, that there's a full day training at least where you're, like we've started it, where you get training and then you need a clear procedure for multiple informants and follow up. Role-playing, feedback, those are also good things to be doing. This, when we talk about what we knew, that other kids often are the ones who know what's going on in the community, in the school. Anonymous reporting is a really tough one, y'all. It sounds easy to do. Sandy Hook Promise has free anonymous reporting, and there have been cases of averted school shootings because of that. The glitch is that in the rollout, you also have to assign school folks to be on call because of when if it happens on a Friday that you get an anonymous tip, then someone needs to be there to respond to what's going to happen. One of the takeaways that's nice about it is it's important low-level things like vaping in the bathroom or bullying on the school bus, that those are being responded to, because otherwise what kids learn is actually if I tell a school adult, nothing really happens, so why am I going to bother telling them that? This is just to share about restorative justice. I think that's a really important concept. When you have retributive justice, what you're talking about is what rule was broken, who broke it, what's the punishment for breaking that rule. And with restorative justice, it's really about what harm was done, what action would repair that harm, and who's responsible for that repair. I had an amazing experience. I was up in upstate Vermont, and I was giving an all-day presentation to a school that provides K through 8 boarding free. And you can imagine a lot of the kids that get there are traumatized kids. It's a really cool school. And one teacher told me about a kindergartner who had blown out of 3 schools and had gotten upset with her teacher and tried to strangle the teacher as she was reaching for the puzzles because the teacher was in the way, and she went ballistic. And they had a restorative justice model, which was new for me. I didn't think about kindergartners being involved with restorative justice. And they separated out the student who had done this, and then they separated out the class, and they asked the class, what would make you feel safe? And then they asked the little girl, what had happened? Why would she do this? How could she keep it from happening again? Girl was totally dysregulated for a little bit. But then she was able to say she was really upset because she thought she wasn't going to have any friends now. And what the students said who were in kindergarten was, we'd be her friend if she didn't strangle the teacher. And then, I mean, in the way that kindergartners can be, they came together, they were able to share that information, and this teacher was telling me, and we didn't have any more difficulties with her. It was 6 weeks out, and this was a kid who had daily aggression, so powerful stuff, I think, restorative justice. Another situation was, I'll just tell you briefly, was a teacher who had said to a student, he was pissed at the student. Never happens, right? Sorry, just me. And said, I dare you to destroy the classroom.
Oh my God.
And the kid destroyed it. I mean, totally destroyed it. So, yeah, you asked me, I'll show you, right? So you could imagine how the staff were like, ooh, Mr. Butler, he's going to hit it from the principal. You know, he's going to get it. And sometimes restorative justice is also from the top down, principal to the teacher. And, you know, the principal brought him in and said, I want you to think about this. Why don't you go home and think about this? Didn't go into disciplinary action. And then they came back and the student and the teacher had a discussion where the teacher could own some of the responsibility. And so I've been in other situations where that's a little harder, but I don't want to make it sound like it's always easy, but okay. I don't want to leave you all overwhelmed. There's a, Gillian Peterson and James Deasley did work on the Violence Project. They have looked at mass shooting epidemics and done research on it. And they created a detailed database and then came out with actionable lessons to prevent mass shootings. And one was, important one was de-escalation. And with our bodies, knowing how to convey safety. He had, and we know this, right? Kids can smell fear. If you're afraid, they know it. The other thing, I love this questionnaire, y'all, the benevolent childhood experience. So, you know, we all talk about adverse childhood events, but this is a questionnaire around what do you need to have a good experience? You know, one caregiver with whom you feel safe, a friend, good neighbors, opportunity to have a good time. I mean, we underestimate play, y'all. Having 3 grandkids now and watching how much they like to play and making sure kids have that chance. And then I also think, I like this one, do you have a predictable home routine like regular meals and a regular bedtime? How much who kids bring in, what they are, is from what's going on with at home. So we're going to shift gears to question and answers, but I have 2 things I wanted to share with you at the end. What you're looking at is a sculpture by Manuel Oliver, whose 17-year-old son Joaquin was killed at Parkland High School. And besides, you know, what we've talked about, which is clinical skills and advocating and providing support for kids, I want to take this moment just also to kind of expand beyond that and to remind us that, you know, we all are members of our community and that, you know, there are systemic things that need to change that are sometimes beyond our control. I'm not, you know, naive enough to think, I think so often you all as educators are asked to bear so much of what is systemically flawed. And I want to appreciate that, but also I love that on top of this is the number of where to vote, because he's sort of saying, you know, we also have other things. And I then also was going to just, and then we're going to open it to questions. This is a poem by Clint Smith. I don't know if you all know Clint Smith. He wrote How the Word is Passed, a really good book if you're looking for a good book. It's a reckoning with the history of slavery across America, really powerful. But this is he's also a poet. And I want us each to make a commitment. We're not going to have a school shooting in this school. We're going to try, right? We can't, I mean, there are things beyond our control, but we're getting fortified so that we can make good decisions, that we can keep each other safe, we can keep our kids safe. So he says, we see another school shooting on the news, and I don't know how I am ever supposed to let you out of my sight. I think of your 6-year-old. I think about those children, how they woke up and had breakfast that morning, as they did all mornings, before half-eaten Pop-Tarts and eggs and a coat of ketchup, how they insisted on wearing their favorite shirt even though it was covered in stains, how they tied their shoes and double knotted them just to be sure, how they smiled when they saw their friends on the bus and told them about the soccer games they'd had that weekend, the goal they'd scored, how none of them could have ever known what was coming. I don't believe that. He didn't get a training. The kids might not have known, but I think as us as adults, we can know what's coming. Sorry to editorialize. I fear everything I cannot control and know that I control nothing. I am standing in a thunderstorm, attempting to shield you from every jagged slice of yellow sky. I am trying to inhale all the smoke from this burning world while asking you to hold your breath. So I think we're holding both, right? We're holding the things we can't protect our kids from and the things that we can protect our kids from. And we can't protect that there's an unreasonable access to guns right now. We can't control the vitriol that's happening right outside of us on multiple levels. But we can control bringing an inquisitive mind, bringing a sense of safety to our kids, bringing a sense of caring, and trying to scaffold them. So, thanks.